We're thrilled to have you here today for Public Service Week, Day 4. And it is really a special honor for us to welcome today's guest because Breanna Gray, basically, and I see a lot of Breanna's classmates joining and other alums, which is really exciting.
Uh-oh, Jill, I think we've lost you.
Oh, no, shoot. Can you hear me now? Everyone knows I'm getting a new computer, so can you hear me? Can you hear me? The new computer has been ordered. We are so thrilled to have Breanna here. It was actually almost 10 years ago, precisely, just by a couple days off. Amazingly, it was almost 10 years ago to the date that young Breanna Gray, who was only a student in the college, decided she was going to sponsor Public Service Week on her own. And she sponsored an amazing lineup of events. We said, who is this amazing first-year Batten student? And it was a wonderful event. And so who would have thought 10 years ago that she would be back now giving an academic talk on the Restrictive Rule Revolution in the House of Representatives. So since Breanna has left us, she's gone on to work in positions in the federal government, and most recently to enroll in a PhD program as a Benjamin Franklin Fellow and a Fontaine Society Fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research areas include contemporary US Congress, congressional rules and procedures, and the ways in which changes made in the contemporary Congress have influenced public policy outcomes, particularly for communities of color, for women, and for low-income neighborhoods. I am going to let her get started on her talk, and then we will open it up to questions. But it is an understatement to say that I am so thrilled to welcome her back in this capacity. You make us very proud, and we can't wait to hear a little bit about what you've been studying. So without further ado, I turn it over to Breanna Gray.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean Rockwell. Jill is how I met her. And thank you so much to Millie and to everyone at the Batten School for inviting me to speak today. This research is so important to me. It's the crux of my dissertation. And so I really am excited to share it with you. I am not opposed to you asking questions along the way. In fact, I think clarifying questions are very helpful for me. And so I just present the first slide, which is the title slide, The Restrictive Rule Revolution in the US House of Representatives. Let's begin. So here's my agenda for today. I'm going to take you on a journey to sort of go through why I'm interested in restrictive rules or special rules, as most people call them. And then I'll talk about the process for rule assignment, as well as some of the existing literature on this topic. I'll get into some of my research questions, but I don't want to get too far in the weeds. But I want to present the methods and some of the results and the implications of my research. Okay, so before I start, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm interested in special rules and how this kind of came upon me. So part of my research involves interviewing members of Congress and their staff. And I pulled this quote from one of the interviews that I had with a congresswoman. I didn't give her name here because I want to protect her privacy, but just to kind of give you a sense of why I'm interested in special rules to begin with, here's a quote. There's not been a lot of bipartisan voting during my time here, especially in the last 4 years, on things like social justice, climate change, etc. There's not been a lot of bipartisan voting in the Senate either, but that is a function of divisiveness that has evolved and grown. Similarly, she says, the minority in the last 4 years in the House have used procedural elements to delay and to kill bills. And really, that's what special rules represent in a lot of places. Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue that special rules are wholly divisive or prompt some sort of negative outcome, but I do want to highlight some of the outcomes of special rules in the modern or contemporary Congress post-1990. So what are special rules? Let's start there. Special rules are rules that govern the legislative process for bills primarily after they're reported out of their committees of jurisdiction. So we all remember the I'm only a bill and sort of the process of ways that bills kind of reach the House floor. Well, this is one of the key processes. So once bills are reported out of their committees of jurisdiction, which is the committee that supervises or oversees the review of that bill, they are sent likely sent to the House Committee on Rules to then assign them a special rule. Now, this ranges on a spectrum from open to closed. We see 4 categories of special rules: open, open modified, structured, and closed. And as you can imagine with the names, they go from very, very liberal to very, very constrained in dynamics. What are open rules? Open rules permit amendments and floor debate. So they allow members of Congress to vocalize their concerns, to offer their opinions on specific pieces of legislation, and to really engage in what I like to call deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy meaning I am inserting myself in the legislative process so that we can learn from each other, perhaps offer some bipartisan comments on a bill that can then, serve the broader demographic or constituency in the US population. Open modified rules permit only amendments that are pre-printed in the congressional record. And so they also put a time cap on the consideration of amendments, or they could do both. So open rules and open modified are sort of the more lenient end of the spectrum. Now we're getting to for structured and closed rules, which are really the subject of my talk. So structured rules limit the amendments that may be offered only to only those amendments designed in a special rule. Similarly, closed rules restrict amendment and floor activity altogether. And so if you have not offered your amendments prior to the House floor, prior to the bill advancing to the House floor, then you really don't have a say-so in that realm of the legislative process. So what's the process for rule assignment? Well, I'm glad you asked. Once a bill is reported out of its committee of jurisdiction, meaning that the committee of jurisdiction has stamped its approval for it to advance to the House floor for a vote, the committee of jurisdiction and House leadership may request for the House Committee on Rules to then assign a special rule to this bill. And as I mentioned earlier, special rules help the bill to navigate in a more efficient and likely effective way the legislative process. And so it prevents some of these legislative bog downs from occurring that can eventually perhaps kill the bill altogether. And so the Committee of Jurisdiction requests the rule assignment. The Rules Committee then holds a hearing where any sort of person who has some sort of connection to this bill, be it a legislative agency, be it the Committee of Jurisdiction, or a general member who has interest, they may offer some input on that rule request. And so they are hoping to try to sway the Rules Committee members to try to determine whether or not this bill needs the special rule or not. Once the Rules Committee has that hearing, they then vote on that rule request. And so they're voting on the open, the spectrum of open to closed rules. The Rules Committee votes yay or nay, likely yay, because it's already sort of been vetted through House leadership, through the Committee of Jurisdiction, through the Rules Committee. And so once that rule is voted favorably, whether it be open, open modified, closed, structured, or closed, then it advances to the House floor for House members to vote on the rule. And so there are a lot of different points where members can offer their input on whether a special rule even should be assigned to a bill. Are you following me here? Awesome. Okay. So once that bill is sent to the House floor for a vote, sent to a House floor for the rule vote, the rule is then voted up or down, favorably or unfavorably, and then we can proceed to vote on the actual bill, the content of the bill itself. So all this happens prior to us even thinking through what the content of the bill is for a vote. Now, the reason I really want to contextualize this in history is because the Rules Committee really wasn't that significant in its earlier stages. It was founded in 1789, and for the first 100 years almost of its existence, we don't see it used very frequently. In fact, for 5 Congresses, no members were appointed to this committee. And, I think part of the story that scholars are giving is that they really didn't have a function. So initially, they were commissioned to report the overall rules of the House. Once that responsibility was taken care of or sent to House leadership, they were disbanded. It wasn't until 1858 that we see a major change happen in the Rules Committee's responsibilities. 1858 marks the year where the Speaker becomes the chairman of the House Rules Committee. And obviously we know how much power the Speaker has. And so that really elevates the power that this committee has and the responsibilities that they can take on. One of the responsibilities being this responsibility of being able to assign special rules. We're moving on now. So once they get this responsibility of being able to assign special rules, which essentially dictate how a bill moves through Congress, whether it's moved with ease, with fewer amendments or not, with multiple amendments, that is really determined by the type of rule assigned. And so here you'll see a graph that depicts the rules that have been assigned from the 103rd Congress to the 116th Congress. So from about 1993 to last year, we see the variation in the types of rules that are assigned. Now, I'm pretty sure that everybody is seeing color in this graph. And so if you use the key here, you'll see that in purple, where my cursor is, we go from about 46 open rules, which open rules, remember, that's when anybody can really offer amendments, when there's really not a limitation on deliberation in the legislative process. We go from about 46 in 1993 to 0 open rules in the 116th Congress. And so that really is a shocking figure. And I'll note that I'm just looking at my notes here. In 1993, 9%. So this 46, the number 46 represents 9% of the overall bills that were assigned special rules in 1993 to 53%. 53% of the total number of special rules were assigned closed rules in 2020. So if you're following me here, we're seeing a trend. We're seeing that there's a significant drop in the number of open rules and a significant increase in the number of closed rules. And so we're seeing kind of this X happen where Congress is getting less deliberative in the post-bill reporting stage. And so we're also seeing with that increasingly closed rules, which I'll get to why that matters. I just want to situate this in some of the existing literature on this topic. I'll not get into all of these scholars, but I will note some of the explanations that they give. So Sarah Bender is a scholar who talks about obstructionism, and she offers this theory that, and proves it very well, this theory that obstructionism in previous Congresses is a good predictor of whether or not there'll be closed rules in future Congresses. And the reason for that is that leadership often used previous Congresses as a marker for whether or not they may see similar trends happen in this Congress. And so the reason that obstructionism perhaps is a good independent variable, if you will, for this study is that we often see that this Bayesian sort of graph that you witnessed in the previous slide, where we see a trend happening and we don't see much variation in that trend. She's reporting that obstructionism is a good or key indicator of why we're seeing these closed rules happen. Similarly, Keith Crable and Cox and McCovens offer the theory about, they similarly share in Bender's sentiments about obstructionism, but they also offer other explanations, some of which are that elections have become increasingly competitive. Now we know that the majority of incumbents are elected, right? It's not the case where a lot of incumbents are being thrown out of office, but we do know that with the rise in media and with social media, we're seeing that more attention is being paid to elections in different aspects of society. And so for that reason, they're arguing that this competition exists. Okay, so the question that I really have, and that I'm trying to relay to you through some of the history and the rise in closed rules, is what factors contribute to the increasing use of restrictive rules? And so I already kind of laid out the theory about obstructionism, electoral competition, but we also see that this fear of uncertainty perhaps may also contribute to the rise in closed rules. Keith Crable being a proponent of that theory, that when members don't really know the terrain, you know, when they're confused, or it's not very clear in how they can render or seek bipartisan work on bills, they decide to just altogether close out their bills. So they request and likely are assigned closed rules to the bills. And then there's also this theory about partisan division and how increasing polarization pulls members and pulls parties apart. And that also prompts less bipartisan work, which then requires you to use closed rules so that the minority would not obstruct your legislative process. So my primary hypothesis here is that the more controversial the bill being referred to the Rules Committee is, and some of the examples I'm giving are immigration, criminal justice reform, minimum wage, gender disparity, et cetera, the more likely we see that it's assigned restrictive or closed house rules. Now, I will couch my talk in this one factor, which is that so far in my research, because of the amount of bills that are introduced every Congress, I'm using the 112th Congress right now. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm pulling data from two data sources. One is a data set that I'm creating myself of just rule assignments. So rules from the 90s to today, present day, and the variation in those rules. So which ones are assigned open, which ones are assigned closed, and the gamut of them. That's one data set. The second data set is from a well-established policy agendas project data set of that's been used by many scholars, but it hasn't been used for this purpose. It hasn't been used to determine how these bills are being assigned special rules and what those special rules mean for the legislation and the outcomes of that legislation. Okay, so with that, my key variables, the first is my dependent variable, which is the rule, obviously, and the independent variables, which I'm still grappling with in terms of the implementation or the research is, are these independent variables: the legislative obstructionism variable, electoral competition, legislative uncertainty, and partisan division. So what I'm presenting to you today is sort of the beginning of this, this research, which talks primarily through descriptive statistics. And so we're seeing that this variation in rule assignment occurs. And then with that, what do we see happen with the legislation? Okay, in terms of my data collection and methods, I'm using, as I mentioned, an analysis of the rules data set that I created, as well as the policy agendas project data set, which gives the gamut of rules that are assigned, the gamut of bills that are introduced into the House from the 80th Congress to the current Congress. And then I'm also planning to conduct a textual analysis of the rule assignments. I think the interesting part about this project is that it's not enough to say that a bill is assigned a rule. I think that tells part of the story. That tells the story that we're seeing trends that happen that we haven't seen in the past. Another aspect, or a step further, would be, what type of bills are these? Are these bills that support certain constituencies? Are these bills that limit the scope of constituent rights? And so I think this text analysis will really help color questions about what bills actually are doing when they're assigned special rules. I'm also planning to conduct 100 interviews. I have several conducted so far, but as I mentioned, I'm still in the data collection process, and so this is ongoing. Okay, so some of my preliminary results are indicated here. based on some of the categories that I'm interested in, categories that I believe from Pew Research Center, from other sources that document polarization in the US population, and these are some of the issues that are deemed polarizing. These are some of the descriptive statistics that we see. So what are you looking at right now? On the x-axis, you're looking at the type of bills that are being introduced in the House. And so I picked some of the categories based on Pew. Pew does studies over time that really get at what are Americans deeming controversial, what polarizes society. And so just to give you an example, one of the issues is voting rights. Another one of the issues is minority discrimination. You see that there are 97 bills, 97 immigration bills that were introduced in this Congress. And so you can see sort of the gamut of issues that are deemed controversial, if you will, or polarizing. And then on the y-axis, you'll see the number of those bills that were introduced in Congress. And so what is this really telling you? I think part of the story that this graph is telling you is where Congress is placing its interest. So in terms of immigration, in terms of employee benefits, you see immigration, there are 97 bills. In employee benefits, there are 68 bills. In elderly assistance, there are 51 bills. And so you're seeing that leadership in Congress has a particular vision of what they want to introduce, but I think this next slide will help sort of color this conversation even further. Okay, so even though we see that this gamut of interest in polarizing bills exist, we don't see that matched in the number of special rules that are assigned. Why is that important? Well, if individuals in society are deeming that these are the issues that we perhaps really need to address, maybe we really need to address immigration, or we really need to address employee benefits and labor union rights, we really need to address education. The problem with that, and the problem with special rules in particular, is that we don't see in this Congress that special rules are being assigned to these types of bills. And so I'll leave you with this. In the 112th Congress, more than half of the bills that are being assigned special rules do not involve issues that are considered polarizing, right? And so that's really shocking in how we think about the initial hypothesis about closed rules, which is that members assign closed rules to their bills or request closed rules for their bills because they think that it will be difficult to gain bipartisan support. But that's not what we're finding. We're finding that bills that address matters of appropriations, matters of budget, matters of taxes, things that have financial or fiscal implications are the ones that are likely assigned closed rules. And when you think about it, the power of the purse is something that Congress, obviously has significant holds on. And so it doesn't, it's not surprising wholeheartedly that Congress is really concerned with how they're exercising the power of the purse, and they're using rules to be able to do that. Now, I will say that this Congress is particularly interesting because it has been deemed the least productive Congress in history, the 112th Congress. And if you remember, we have a split Tea Party introduced in this Congress. We also have a Senate that's not within the same party as the House. We also have a different president that's not within the same party as the House. And so there are a lot of dynamics going on in this Congress that may also introduce some level of complication in this analysis. But I still think the story is telling that under this Congress, I'll just allude to the party that's in office, the Republican Party, we do see that the focus is less on the issues that are deemed polarizing and more on the issues addressing the fiscal implications of bills. And we see that those bills are overwhelmingly assigned closed and structured rules, with less than 10% of the bills that are deemed polarizing. So the bills that address immigration. And if you remember, I was working in the Department of Homeland Security at the time. If you remember, around this time, we were seeing a significant increase in the number of unaccompanied children crossing the border. So although the American public is really focusing on this conversation about immigration, we don't see that's matched in the types of bills that are being assigned closed rules to then be advanced to the House floor without sort of amendment bog downs. Any questions? Okay, so with that, I just want to end with some implications of this research. And there are a lot. Part of the story is that we're living in a society where deliberation is not always seen as the most productive use of our time. When Americans are hurting and we see that there are financial challenges within different pockets of US society, the go-to is to figure out what legislation can we market to the mass of our particular party, and what particular procedural elements can then help us to advance that bill without needing bipartisan support. And I argue that I don't know that that's the best way to legislate. I mean, when you think about the growing diversity in society, we're going to have to deal with some of these issues that are polarizing. We're going to have to address some of the concerns of the population that is being birthed right now. And so if we're working through a lens of only using closed rules and only using structured rules where we aren't able to, or where we don't have to go across the aisle to have success in our legislative pursuits, then that's doing a huge disservice to the deliberative process and making sure that we're achieving efficiencies, not repeating the same issues that we've seen in previous instances when we don't reach across the aisle or talk among each other. So this leads to sort of the effects of siloed or partisan policymaking, which could potentially be harmful. Similarly, it creates incentives for members to perform in ways that only benefit their constituents. And I argue that produces a variety of inefficiencies in how we're addressing the power of the purse. And it also introduces this notion that bipartisanship isn't necessary, or it isn't a long-term goal. We're only using the short-term method of using closed and structured rules to achieve our goal without concerns for overall long-term bipartisanship. And then, this causes challenges for future deliberation and future obstructionism in Congress. So we really want to know, are restrictive rules becoming a part of standard legislative strategy, which I argue could potentially be very detrimental and harmful to the political process and to the overall concept of deliberative democracy to begin. That is all I have for you today. If you have questions or, oh, I see a hand up.
Yeah, hey Breanna.
Hi there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciated it, and glad you're doing this work. I think it's important work. I was in the Obama administration during the 112th Congress, and I remember it well. One of the questions I had was about how you were defining controversial and polarizing, because it struck me that you're giving your opponent a victory of any kind itself became polarizing.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent
controversial. So
that's an excellent question.
Yeah, moved away from substance of legislation to suggest I want to quite explicitly under McConnell, block any success from the other side. And
absolutely.
How does that affect how we think about what is controversial, what is polarizing, and the prospects for bipartisanship?
That's a great question, and I measure it through a number of ways. One is through previous Congresses' measures of bipartisanship. And so in looking at previous Congresses and what issues have significant bipartisan support, that's one of the measures for determining whether something is polarizing or not, controversial or not. So if we see that in previous Congresses, this issue has not we found bipartisan support on both sides, then that's something that I would deem, or that this project deems less controversial. Whereas in previous Congresses, if we see that there are issues in gaining bipartisan support, so I'll use an example. There is one of the variables is elementary and secondary education. And while you would think that that is not altogether a controversial issue, in previous Congresses, so much has been talked about why Democrats and why Republicans are not able to create legislation on this that would be seen as bipartisan. And so, that's one of the reasons why you can't sort of use your own gut instinct. You have to use precedent, and you have to follow trend analysis. I'll also say that Pew is another way that I determine what's considered controversial. They have a good measure, I would argue, of what the US population deems as controversial or polarizing. And they have a scale of like 1 to 7 of a controversy level. And so 1 being like less controversial, 7 being highly controversial. And with that, I can gauge like the level of controversy. I don't know if that fully answered your question.
I'm going to try to let Craig go, but I'm quite curious, what is still uncontroversial these days? I got to go find that Pew study.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
What's ranked a 1? Because I can't think of very many things at the moment.
Yeah, no, and I think that is a limitation, right? I think that's part of the story, is like, if we're seeing that in the legislative arena, that we're making everything a controversial issue. If we're challenging every piece of legislation, then this further complicates the story, or further gives rise to this variable of obstructionism, right? And this obviously is a predictor of, based on Bender's work and some of the other scholars that I previously alluded to, they argue that obstructionism and this notion that everything is controversial is leading us to become even more closed in how we pursue policy. So yeah, no, I totally take your point, and I agree.
I actually think Lillian Frost had her hand raised, and she is another PhD candidate in politics. So your class had a real academic, lots of academic discussions going on back then.
Hi, Lily.
Hi, yeah, it's so great to see you guys. I'm actually now an assistant professor, though I maybe shouldn't say that it's at Virginia Tech.
Oh, congratulations, Lily. That's awesome.
Right.
So right now I'm at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. So it's been kind of a wild year.
Oh, that's awesome. Congratulations.
I was so excited to learn more about your work, Breanna. It's been a few years since we've had our political science PhD chats. So it's really interesting to see how this is coming along. My question was, and I'm not that familiar with the literature that you cited as your main independent variables, as someone who focuses more on Middle East politics.
Right. Yeah.
But I'm wondering about sort of the role of signaling to constituents and what that might play in this decision to use closed rules. And so kind of following up on Dean Solomon's remarks of, wanting to prevent the other side maybe from getting to debate, from getting to signal some kind of win to their constituents, as well as for that majority side being able to do that, and what kind of signaling role it might play, and how that might line up with the types of policies where they're used more. Because it seems like your hypothesis so far isn't necessarily being supported, where it's not these controversial policies that the closed rules are being implemented on, it's fiscal ones. And so I'm wondering, is this a way to signal to your constituents that you're doing what they want? Or is there some element of maybe, if there's no debate across the board, is it maybe hiding some things that might look bad to constituents? I'm just kind of curious to hear a little bit more about any roles that this kind of signaling might play in the story.
Absolutely. And that's a great observation. I totally agree. I think part of the story in this whole conversation about legislative uncertainty and electoral competition is that to to target those issues as a member, to target those sort of concerns or issues, I'm going to introduce legislation, even though I know that it may not, go far. It's sort of a symbolic gesture to my constituents that this is something, I'm fighting for you, I'm working on your behalf. Perhaps I know it may not gather bipartisan support, but it's still something to show you that I'm doing work that is reflective of the time and reflective of the issue. And I think that's an example of that is with immigration in this Congress. And so 97, I think the number was 97 bills were introduced that addressed immigration. There were not one of them was in the in the percentage of bills that were assigned closed rules. And so that is, I think, one of the biggest examples of signaling that, I'm introducing legislation, but it's so controversial and it's so obstructionist that more work needs to be done to figure out how we can pass something that I know you're interested in, but that we don't have the proper support for. So absolutely, I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but I take your point, and I think a lot of this story is that Congress has an agenda, that leadership has an agenda, and that even though there are select issues that they want to target every year, they can't only say that we're going to do appropriations every year, right? We're only going to reappropriate or reauthorize. We have to say, we're reflecting the times, we're reflecting the issues of the day. We don't necessarily know or think that we may gather a bipartisan support for it, but we do have to do our job and reflect what our constituents are saying. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. My hypothesis was not true in that, while I'm thinking that based on Congress having an ear to the streets and having an ear to constituent concerns and using their concerns to inform their policy preferences and policy choices in the bills that they sponsor, it's not the case where we see that rules are being assigned in the same way. So yeah, your point is absolutely correct. And signaling, I think, is a huge, huge part. And I'll also note that this data set that I'm using, I see Professor Volden with his hand raised. One of the things that I will note in this data set is that a high percentage of bills that are seen as symbolic are not even included. And so they'll include them, but then they'll factor them out once they do their own analysis of the substantive impacts of the bills. And based on their measure of symbolic or substantive, they'll determine which ones stay in the data set. And so even with these substantive bills, we see that a lot of them obviously didn't gather or garnish bipartisan support. And so we don't see that, that they're successful in the process. Hi, Professor Volden, I see your hand.
Hi, this is awesome. Thank you so much for sharing with us. These are great sets of questions. Mine comes from how you were thinking about this in terms of bipartisanship, and really thinking about the earlier stages before things get to the floor of the House. It feels like I could be okay with closed rules if, we had a committee chair who really incorporated both parties' ideas, and if, the bill sponsor was working to build that bipartisan coalition, and we could see that with co-sponsors and so on. And so I was wondering, one thing that I would find really intriguing, and maybe you're drawn to this as well, is testing a couple different hypotheses on the bipartisanship. One is, do we get different rules when co-sponsors are already on both sides than if they're only on one side? Those would point to very different ideas. And we've had the opportunity to talk to a bunch of committee chairs, and some of them are just really open in markup of having both parties' ideas incorporated, and some of them aren't so much. And so maybe looking at what committees these are coming from, and maybe a variable would be, does that committee release bills from both parties, or is that really a partisan committee only releasing bills from one of the parties? Might come together with these closed and open rules in ways that are really interesting. So cool work, and would love to hear more on that front.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think one of the limitations of the time is that I had 8 total hypotheses. I only
we
presented
go.
one today,
Yeah.
just for time's sake, but no, for sure, that is like something that I'm considering. I like the way you put it though. So I may alter my dissertation to reflect more of like the exact wording that you used, but no, for sure. I think that's a huge factor in this, is like how bipartisan is the actual committee of jurisdiction to begin with, to then reflect the type of bills that are coming out of it for, closed or restrictive rule assignments.
Awesome. We have some of these data. I'm happy to share anything. So just reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think I see 2 other. Oh, I see Jasmine. I'm not sure who's first. Hi. I'd love to see my former classmates on this call.
It's wonderful to see you. I decided at the last minute to join this, and I'm really glad that I did. For those of you I don't know, I'm Jasmine. I was Breanna's classmate, and I actually work as a legislative director, not on the Hill, but off the Hill in a advocacy organization. And so it's interesting to think about this in I'll say in theory, right? Because you're doing the research rather than in practice, where we're actually trying to, pass legislation. And I don't care if the rule is closed or not. Like, if this is the right thing for people, then, that's what we want done. So it's definitely a mind shift for me to think of it in is this bipartisan, or do I care that it's bipartisan? So the other thing that it made me think was about how this, I know your research is focused on the House, but how this aligns in the Senate, where we're saying right now, 60 is what we need to get everything passed. And for the most part, we don't have supermajorities in the Senate. And so now there's an effort to get rid of the filibuster, because the majority is not able to rule right now because of that. It's just, and that brings up the obstructionist thing again. So have you at all sort of outlined what it looks like on a parallel track that the Senate has this thing where 60 people are necessary, and it's making things end up in a graveyard, as we call it?
Yeah.
Never go anywhere.
No, that's a great point. And I think in a larger book project, I absolutely want to take that on. I think there's some differences between the House and the Senate, one being term limits, the terms that they have that influence the independent variables in mind. So I think obstructionism being one. Like, I think for the Senate in particular, I don't know that we have the same level of obstructionist tactics. One, there aren't as many members, and 2, they have a good amount of time to be able to do their work. They have 6 years, and so the sort of the rush to get legislation passed so that you can show your constituents symbolically or in actual bill passage that I've done this work, I've worked on your behalf. I don't know that same dynamic exists in the Senate, and so that's one key difference. The other key difference, I think, is in how their rules work all together. And so in terms of special rules and the spectrum of open to close, it's not the same. And so I totally take your point, because my next thought is how does this play out on the other side of the Hill? But I think there are some other questions I have to think through first before I get to this conversation about whether or not we should care about obstructionism if it's doing the work and it's getting the job done, or excuse me, whether or not we should care about bipartisanship if it's doing the work and getting the job done and it's serving the constituents. Why do we care about reaching across the aisle? So no, I take your point. I think I have some homework to do on that sphere, but that's something I'm certainly thinking about for a greater book project. Karlik, I think I see you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Cool. I didn't want to be the only class of 2012 alum not to ask you a question.
Oh, no.
Well, hearing what you said, I cover the state legislature in Colorado as a journalist, and we have a couple of rules here that kind of intertwine. One is that legislators have a cap on the number of bills they can introduce, and the other is that every bill that's introduced has to get a hearing and a vote. So you've got this kind of dynamic of legislators pressured to make their bills count, but also there's more pressure to get bipartisan sponsors so bills will actually advance further in the process. Do you have an opinion on whether something like that in Congress might change the outcome, or is it just fundamentally not suited to a body of 535 legislators?
You hit the nail on the head. I think part of the reason they use this whole closed framework in the first place is because there are just so many people who could object. And with closed rules, there aren't amendment allowances. There aren't floor debate allowances. And it helps make the process more efficient. And if you, I don't know that I put it in any of my slides, but this was the least productive, quote unquote, Congress, least productive being that they passed, I think, 290 laws, compared to like 500 or whatever is in like the normal session. So still 290 is a good number. But there were over 12,000 bills introduced in this Congress. So imagine having hearings on that number of bills and whether or not, we would even go anywhere in terms of actual votes. Because the terms are 2 years. And so if we don't get to vote on it within that 2-year window, a member is going to have to reintroduce that same bill. And we see that happen. I remember when I was working on the Hill, I can't remember the congressman, but he would introduce the same bill to to defund the Department of State every year. And I'm like, why are you introducing this every year? Like, it's probably not going to get passed. Like, there's no hope in bipartisan support for this. But it's just it's a trend, and it would never get to the floor for vote before the congressional session ended. So I think you hit the nail on the head with this, and that there are just so many members that it's really hard to offer that same, I guess, due process, if you will, by giving a hearing to each bill and giving a vote for each bill. I just don't know that they would get to, just by the numbers, they would get to it by the end of the congressional session, given their calendar, given their August recess. It's just, there's so many factors at play that wouldn't work. And I defer to the experts, Dr. Bolden, like all the folks here, but that was a great question. I mean, I'm thinking through like what's ideal for democracy and deliberation, but at the same time, we also need to serve the needs of constituents. So it's a tough line to toe. Dr. Bolden, did you have something on this? I can't really see. I'm trying to think if I see anyone else.
Yeah, the only thing I would comment there is just the big difference between what's going on in state legislatures and what's going on in Congress at this point, and trying to learn from one to the next, what might work for democracy? That's a great question.
Yeah. Other questions? I don't know that I see any other hands up.
Breanna, if you could hear me, I'm sorry, keep toggling between. I was just curious if a lot of our students sometimes express interest in getting a PhD. If you could just give, from the standpoint of what it's like, how earning a PhD and studying for a PhD and researching compares to sort of graduate work at the Batten School.
No, that's a great question. And that's something I really had to think through before I decided to come back, was like, what skills did I already have and what skills would I have to learn? And I think from Batten, and one of the best skills I learned from my Batten journey was how to think critically about policy issues, policy areas and questions, how to situate what the ideal goal was with like what's practical to get done. And so thinking through those sorts of questions absolutely prepared me. I think the jump from an MPP to a PhD, I think, and Lily can also, I'm sure, speak to this, but the jump for me, or like the skill set I think I really needed to learn was sort of the literature. I think the academic literature and how to situate or couch your own theory within a body of work that has already been, there, David Mayhew's and people who have really been doing this work for decades, and what differences your literature or your, the work that you're hoping to contribute has from what's already been done. And so I think that has been like my, one of the key challenges. And I think too, the type of research that you do. One of the reasons I tell people that I decided to come back to academia is that I wasn't feeling in the government. I was working in the government before, and I feel like in the agency that I was working for, the type of research they were open to, I don't think matched what was needed to be able to say I rightfully used U.S. tax dollars, right? Like, it's almost this like good enough for government research. And I don't think that's good enough. I think when you have the responsibility of using taxpayer dollars, you should be doing your top research. You should be trying to create efficiencies. You should, you should reflect what the needs of constituents are, in addition to, what practical things you can actually do. But that's one of the reasons I made the jump from the policy world, like practitioner space, to academia. And my end goal is to hopefully marry those two. I think Batten does a great job with that. I think in terms of like professors of practice and strong academics, I think, people who are in academia, I think that you have good conversations between those populations. And I think you arrive at better policy outcomes because of it. I know that was kind of a long-winded answer, but that was a great question, Dean Rockwell.
Breanna, I have a question, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear just what keeps you motivated and kind of all of the numbers and data and everything that you're just kind of swimming in. What do you love kind of at the heart of this work?
I think those aha moments, like, for example, with my hypothesis, when I had this hypothesis where I was thinking like, oh my goodness, I would think that members would introduce bills and want to fight for the, rules for these bills so they can pass with ease. I didn't see that was the case, right? I saw, as Lily mentioned, like the symbolism in the bills that were being introduced. So I think it's really like those moments where you're just like, oh my goodness, like I'm doing work that I don't think anyone else is doing, but it really speaks volumes in terms of how policies actually work. In my mind, I had thought it was a certain way, and then in practice, like really, it's a totally different way. So I think the aha moments, the fact that that eventually this work may have some sort of practical use in the future, and just the pure love. Like, I really do love Congress. Like, I think it's such an institution where there's so much potential. There's so much that can be done, and I think that love and that desire to make it its best is what kind of motivates me. But that's a great question. I see Dr. Bolden's hand up again.
Sure, we had a couple more minutes, so I wanted to throw out one more question for you, which is you've been treating the open and closed rules as a dependent variable. I'm wondering kind of more as an independent variable especially, in the 112th, if we're trying to ram something through on partisan lines in the House, it's not going to work in the Senate, which is controlled by the other party. And so do you think an open rule might make some of these bills more viable when it crosses over to the Senate? And might you be able to detect that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And that's something I'm absolutely planning on doing, is switching from the dependent variable being rules to the independent variable. I haven't done it yet, but that's certainly on my radar. And I mean, I do think it makes a difference. Like, I was on the phone with a rules committee staffer the other day, and I was like, well, why would you want to introduce something with an open rule? Like, what would be the rationale? Because if it's open, that means that you're just saying that there can be different perspectives offered, different voices, opinions heard. And isn't that supposed to be the case anyway? Well, she said, there's nothing that solidifies it. The open rule solidifies that you can officially offer your amendments, your comments, your thoughts at this juncture. And so if you don't sort of push for the open rule, then you run the risk of it being closed. You run the risk of somebody else pushing for it to be closed. And so, no, I take your point in that I do need to think about switching it from independent to dependent, but also what do open rules really suggest? And is it the case that when you have more open rules, do we see that bipartisanship is really something that flourishes in those circumstances? My inclination is yes. But I haven't found
Yeah, that's awesome, especially if you can back that up, right? My
exactly.
yes as well, and seeing the data for that would be really helpful. So
yeah,
best wishes. Love to see this project.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your input. Any other comments?
Well, I think Jill keeps coming in and out. Her internet connection is not very good right now. So, and I joked with Breanna before we started that she's from the Jill Rockwell Career Services era, not the Steve Hiss Career Services era. So this is actually the first time we've met. But certainly on behalf of the faculty and the staff and your fellow alums and classmates, it looks like on the call, we thank you for taking the time. And I can be an occasional C-SPAN junkie and I hear the rule this and the rule that, and I didn't quite understand what it meant. So it certainly has been educational for me to hear about your research and about that particular issue in the House. So if there are no other questions, and Jill's trying again to come back in, I'll thank you on behalf of everybody here. She's got the 3 dots. Are you back, Jill?
I'm here. I don't know
Right,
what.
well, I was just wrapping up, so I'll let you get the last word in.
Just Breanna, I apologize. Like I said at the beginning, I have a new computer on the way. But we could not be more thankful to have you. And it was so great to see our alums today, students and our faculty. Thank you for coming. And Breanna, we wish you the best of luck and look forward to checking in as you continue with your research.